The dark stretch of road ahead of him was illuminated only by the headlights of his rig, casting long shadows on the barren desert landscape. Tom Grizzly Moore, a veteran trucker with 25 years behind the wheel, had seen it all on America's highways. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the night that would haunt him forever. It was mid-October, just before Halloween, when Tom had been assigned a long-haul route across the desolate highways of New Mexico. His destination was Las Vegas, and it was going to be a grueling hour drive. He didn't mind the solitude, though. The long hours on the road gave him time to think and clear his mind. But that night, as the miles rolled by, a creeping unease settled over him. The landscape was eerie, flat plains, scrubby bushes, and jagged cliffs framed by an inky sky. The road was empty, completely devoid of other vehicles. Tom found it strange. Usually there'd be at least a few other trucks or cars out this way, especially on this stretch of Highway 285, known among truckers for its desolate beauty and strange occurrences. Tom switched on the radio to break the silence, but all he got was static. He sighed and turned it off. "Damn dead zone," he muttered to himself, glancing at his GPS, which flickered ominously before going blank. He had driven this route a dozen times before, so he wasn't worried about getting lost. But the fact that the GPS had cut out at the same time the radio went dead unsettled him. As he drove on, a flicker of movement appeared in the corner of his eye. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced into the side mirror, half expecting to see a deer darting out from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the desert and the endless black ribbon of highway. He shifted in his seat, trying to shake off the growing tension. "Get it together, Grizzly," he muttered. 20 minutes later, that's when he saw it. Up ahead, standing at the side of the road, was a lone figure. Tom squinted through the windshield. It was a woman, her arms raised in a waving gesture, signaling for help. Her figure was faintly illuminated by the moonlight and the distant beams of his headlights. Tom slowed the truck and pulled over cautiously. His first instinct was to help. After all, truckers look out for each other and for stranded travelers. But as he drew closer, something about the woman unnerved him. She was wearing a white dress, old-fashioned, like something out of the 1950s, and her hair was dark and matted, hanging limply around her shoulders. Tom rolled down the window. "You all right, ma'am? Need a lift?" The woman's face was pale, almost translucent, with deep shadows beneath her eyes. She didn't say anything, just nodded slowly and pointed down the road, as if indicating where she wanted to go. "Hop in," Tom said, his voice hesitant. He unlocked the passenger door, and the woman climbed in without a word. She smelled faintly of roses, but there was another scent beneath it, something metallic, almost like blood. The woman didn't speak, but she stared straight ahead, her hands resting limply in her lap. Tom tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up his spine. He'd never been one to scare easily, but there was something about this woman that felt wrong. After a few miles of uncomfortable silence, Tom tried to strike up a conversation. "So, you from around here?" he asked. The woman turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward the horizon. Tom glanced at her finger, following the direction she was indicating. There was nothing ahead except the endless stretch of road and the distant silhouette of mountains. He swallowed hard. "Where do you need to go?" The woman finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, as if it came from far away. "The town, just ahead. The one by the cliffs." Tom frowned. "Ain't no town around here, ma'am. Closest place is a good 50 miles south." The woman's expression didn't change. She simply stared ahead, her face devoid of emotion. Unease gnawed at Tom's gut, but he kept driving. Maybe she was confused, disoriented. It wasn't unusual for people to get turned around in the desert. Another 10 minutes passed, and the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The desert around him seemed to press in, the air thick with tension. He couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched, not by the woman, but by something unseen. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror reflexively, and his heart jumped into his throat. The back of his cab was empty, but for a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw movement, something dark, a shifting shadow. He glanced at the woman again. Her expression hadn't changed, but her eyes seemed darker now, almost black, "I think you should get out," Tom said, his voice wavering. The woman turned her head slowly to look at him, and her lips twisted into a small, eerie smile. "We're almost there," she whispered. Tom's pulse raced. He slammed his foot on the brakes, causing the truck to screech to a halt on the shoulder of the road. "Get out!" he yelled, his voice trembling with fear. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the windshield. "Look," she said, her voice low and haunting. Tom followed her gaze and felt the blood drain from his face. Up ahead, where there should have been nothing but empty road, was a town, a small, old-fashioned town that hadn't been there moments before. The buildings were dark and abandoned, their windows shattered, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned to look at the woman, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if she had never been there at all. Tom's breathing quickened, his hands shaking as he clutched the steering wheel. He felt an overwhelming urge to get away, to escape whatever nightmare he had stumbled into. Without thinking, he slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, speeding away from the ghostly town. His hands were slick with sweat, and his heart thundered in his ears as he drove faster and faster, not daring to look back. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of the next real town, hours later, that he dared to pull over. Shaking, he stepped out of the cab and lit a cigarette, trying to calm his nerves. That night, Tom checked into a motel and refused to drive until morning. He didn't tell anyone what had happened, afraid they'd think he was losing his mind. But deep down, he knew what he had seen was real. And from that day on, every time he drove down Highway 285, he couldn't help but scan the road, half expecting to see the phantom hitchhiker once again. For the rest of his life, Tom would tell the tale of the woman in white and the ghost town that appeared out of nowhere. But no one believed him. And in the trucker community, his story became another chapter in the long, eerie folklore of America's haunted highways. Tom Grizzly Moore's life on the road was never quite the same after that night on Highway 285. The encounter left him rattled, a feeling that no amount of time behind the wheel could shake. Fellow truckers, always sharing tall tales over greasy diner coffee, dismissed his story as just another roadside hallucination caused by exhaustion. But Tom knew better. Something out there was watching, lurking along the stretches of road where few dared to stop. Weeks passed, but the ghostly encounter stayed with him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. The woman's pale face, the way her eyes seemed to peer right into his soul, and that impossible town, it haunted his dreams. He found himself driving with the radio on full blast, just to drown out his own thoughts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom was assigned another route heading back through New Mexico. He hesitated, the memory of that strange woman still fresh, but work was work. The road called, and he needed the paycheck. As night fell, Tom felt the familiar chill return. He hadn't even crossed into the state yet, but the sky seemed darker than usual, the stars hidden behind thick clouds that seemed to cling unnaturally low to the earth. He glanced at his dashboard clock, 9:17 p.m. Still hours to go before he would reach his stop for the night. Just as he was adjusting himself in his seat, a flash of movement appeared in the distance. His hands tightened on the wheel as he approached it, another figure standing by the side of the road. His pulse quickened, and the memories of that night rushed back. Tom slowed down, squinting to make out the form. This time, it wasn't a woman. It was a man, tall and thin, standing by a broken-down car with its hood propped up. He waved, signaling for help, just like the woman had. Tom's instincts screamed at him to keep driving. But something in the man's desperate waving tugged at his sense of duty. What if he really needs help? Tom muttered to himself. He pulled over cautiously, the truck's headlights casting an eerie glow on the man's gaunt figure. His face was pale and drawn, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. Tom lowered his windows slightly, keeping his foot ready to hit the gas. "You all right?" Tom asked, his voice echoing into the night. The man stepped closer to the truck, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He had a scruffy beard and wore an old leather jacket, but something about him seemed off, like he didn't quite belong in this era. I need a ride," the man said, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. Tom hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him not to let the stranger in, But his heart, always a little too soft for his own good, overruled his head. "All right, get in," Tom said reluctantly, unlocking the passenger door. The man climbed into the cab, his presence instantly filling the confined space with an oppressive energy. Tom noticed the same smell again, the faint scent of roses, mixed with that metallic tang. His gut twisted. "You from around here?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared straight ahead, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. After what felt like an eternity, he finally muttered, "I was." Tom's grip on the wheel tightened. "You headed somewhere in particular?" The man turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Tom with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "There's a town, up ahead, by the cliffs." Tom's heart stopped. It was the exact same words the woman had used. Cold sweat dripped down the back of his neck as panic crept in. "No way," Tom muttered, more to himself than to the stranger. "That town doesn't exist." The man smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a twisted, eerie grin that made Tom's stomach churn. "Oh, it's real all right. You've seen it, haven't you?" Tom's blood ran cold. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The man's smile faded and his eyes darkened. "Doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you've been marked." "Marked? For what?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. He handed it to Tom without a word. Tom took the photo, his hands shaking. It was an old, black-and-white picture of a family standing in front of a house. The woman in the photo wore a white dress, her hair dark and matted, just like the hitchhiker he had picked up weeks ago. Standing beside her was the same man now sitting in his truck, but younger, healthier, and smiling. Tom's heart raced. "This is you," he said, barely able to keep his voice steady. The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That was us. Before." "Before what?" The man's face twisted in pain, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Before the town took us." Tom stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean the town took you?" The man's eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "That place, it's a trap. Once you see it, you're part of it. We tried to leave, but you can't. Not really. We thought we could escape, but the town always finds a way to bring you back." Tom felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "I don't understand." "You will," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Soon." Before Tom could respond, the man vanished. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone, leaving the passenger seat empty and cold. Tom slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled over to the side of the road, breathing heavily as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He looked down at the photograph still clutched in his hand, but it was gone too, just like the man. Shaking, Tom stepped out of the truck, scanning the empty desert for any sign of the stranger. There was nothing, only the cold wind whispering through the scrubby bushes. He didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, the neon glow of a gas station sign flickering in the distance like a beacon of safety. As he pulled into the lot, his hands still trembling, Tom knew one thing for certain. That ghost town wasn't just some figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was waiting for him. Tom didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the woman in white and the man in the leather jacket, their hollow eyes staring at him from the edge of that cursed town. And deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't outrun it forever. One day, the town would call him back, and when it did, there would be no escaping. Tom's nerves were shot, and as much as he tried to shake it off, the haunting memories clung to him like a bad dream that refused to fade with the morning light. The rest of his drive passed in a blur of adrenaline, and by the time he parked his rig at a truck stop on the outskirts of Albuquerque, he was exhausted. He had been awake for over 20 hours, but sleep seemed like an impossibility now. He slumped into a booth at the diner, ordered a black coffee, and stared out the window at the endless stretch of desert highway. Even in the artificial glow of the truck stop, shadows seemed to creep along the edges of the parking lot. His mind replayed the night's events, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe he was just tired, hallucinating from lack of sleep. That's what the other truckers always said when spooky stories got swapped over late-night meals. But deep down, Tom knew it wasn't just exhaustion. He couldn't deny what he had seen. The woman, the man, the vanishing photograph, and that impossible town. There was something real and malevolent lurking out there in the desert, waiting, watching. The waitress brought his coffee and a piece of pie. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a face that had seen too many long shifts. "Rough night?" she asked, setting down the plate. Tom looked up, almost startled by her presence. "You could say that. Anything you want to talk about?" Tom hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't even know where to start." She gave him a knowing look. "Lots of truckers come through here with stories. Things they see out on the road, strange things." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You hear a lot of stories like that?" "More than you'd think." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There's something about these highways, especially the ones that cut through the desert. People see things that ain't supposed to be there. Ghosts, they say. Cursed places." Tom's heart pounded as he realized she might actually believe him. "You ever hear about a town just past the cliffs on Highway 285? The waitress's face went pale, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron nervously. "You're not talking about that place, are you?" Tom leaned forward. "What place?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. "The Lost Town. That's what some folks call it. They say it only appears to certain people. Truckers, mostly. People who are alone, out on those empty stretches of road at night." Tom's mouth went dry. "What happens to the people who see it?" The waitress glanced around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "Depends who you ask. Some say they just disappear, vanish into thin air. Others say they get trapped there, like it's a town full of ghosts, and you become one of them if you stay too long." Tom shivered. "You believe in all that?" The waitress shrugged. "I don't know what to believe anymore. I've heard enough stories to know something's not right out there. A few years ago, a trucker came through here, talking about a woman in white who waved him down on the side of the road. Sound familiar?" Tom's stomach dropped. "I picked up a hitchhiker tonight. A woman, she disappeared. And then later, I picked up a man. Same thing. He just vanished." The waitress's eyes widened. "That's exactly what he said happened. The woman, then a man. They're a part of it, the town, I mean. Luring people in." Tom's pulse quickened. "What happened to him? The trucker you're talking about?" She shook her head sadly. "He left here around midnight, heading south. Never heard from him again. His rig was found abandoned about 20 miles up the road, but no sign of him anywhere. It's like he just disappeared." Tom's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but it was a puzzle he didn't want to understand. Something out there was drawing people in, people like him. And once you saw that town, there was no escaping it. The man in his truck had said as much. "You've been marked." Tom pushed the plate of pie away, his appetite gone. "What do I do?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. "How do I stop it?" The waitress glanced at the clock on the wall. "I don't know if you can stop it. Most people don't get a second chance. If you've seen them once, they'll come for you again. But there's something I've heard that might help." Tom's breath caught in his throat. "What is it?" She leaned in closer. "The town's not always there. Sometimes it's just a mirage, a trick to lure you in. But if you see it again, don't stop. Don't look at it, don't acknowledge it. Keep driving no matter what. If you slow down even for a second, they'll take you." Tom swallowed hard. "That's it? Just keep driving?" The waitress nodded. "That's the only advice I've got. It's not much, but it's kept some truckers alive. The ones who didn't stop." Tom sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a vice. He wasn't sure if he believed her or if any of this was even real, but something told him it didn't matter. Whether it was a curse, a haunting, or something beyond his understanding, the only thing he could do was keep moving. He left a generous tip on the table, paid for his coffee, and headed back to his truck. The night air was cold, and the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of the parking lot, darker and more oppressive than they should have been. As he climbed into the cab, he glanced around the empty lot, half expecting to see a pale figure standing in the distance. But there was nothing, just the hum of distant highway traffic and the rustling of the wind through the desert scrub. Tom started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out ahead of him, dark and empty. He drove in silence, his mind racing, waiting for something to happen, for the town to reappear, for the hitchhikers to show up again. But the miles rolled by, and there was nothing but the dark desert. Maybe he'd outrun it. Maybe the waitress was right, and as long as he kept driving, he'd be safe. But as the hours passed and the sun began to rise, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. Somewhere, far behind him, he imagined that ghost town waiting, its empty streets and broken windows calling out to him in the silence of the desert. And deep down he knew the truth. It would come for him again, and when it did, there would be no escaping. For the next few weeks, Tom tried to settle back into his routine, but nothing felt the same. Every drive through the desert seemed like it was filled with eyes watching him from the darkness, hidden just out of view. Even during daylight hours, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was following him, tracking his movements. He couldn't forget the waitress's words. If you slow down even for a second, they'll take you. The encounters with the hitchhikers had left him rattled, but it was more than just the shock. He could feel something changing around him, like the rules of reality had shifted. His usual hauls down the interstate took on a new, haunted quality. Any flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made his heart race. He'd glance out the window at a passing bush, only to be sure it had just moved. At night, every headlight in his rearview mirror felt like it belonged to a vehicle that wasn't supposed to be there. Maybe not even from this world. But there was no avoiding the inevitable. His dispatcher called with another job, this time taking him right back through the desolate stretch of Highway 285. The route Tom dreaded. "You want me to reroute this one, Grizz?" his dispatcher Larry asked, sensing the hesitation in Tom's voice. "I know you had some issues last time." Tom stared at the map of his route, his hands trembling ever so slightly. He could make an excuse. He could refuse. But that nagging feeling like running away would only make things worse kept him from turning it down. "Nah, Larry, I got it," Tom said, forcing his voice to sound steady. "It's just a road, right?" Larry chuckled on the other end. "Yeah, just a road. See you on the other side, big guy." Tom hung up, but the sense of impending doom didn't leave. He could almost hear the ghost town calling him, like a whisper that followed him into his dreams. He packed up his gear, trying to keep his mind focused on the job. But every part of him screamed that something was wrong. He was heading back into the lion's den. 2 nights later, he was rolling down that same cursed stretch of Highway 285. The sky was ink black, stars hidden behind clouds that seemed unnaturally thick. Tom kept his eyes glued to the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His radio crackled with intermittent static, as if something was interfering with the signal. He didn't even bother trying to change the station. He just wanted to get through this. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The road stretched on endlessly. The only sounds the hum of his engine, and the tires rolling over the asphalt. Maybe, just maybe, it was all in his head. Maybe the town wouldn't appear again. Then, at the edge of his headlights, Tom saw something, movement. A figure on the side of the road. He slowed down, his breath catching in his throat. The silhouette became clearer, a woman in white. She was waving. It was her, the hitchhiker. Tom's heart raced, his body tensing with fear. He instinctively lifted his foot off the gas, ready to stop. But then the waitress's words echoed in his mind, "Don't stop, don't look, keep driving." His foot hesitated over the brake, but he slammed it back on the gas pedal. The truck roared forward. The woman's figure flickered in his peripheral vision, almost as if she was shimmering in and out of existence. She waved more frantically, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Tom forced his eyes forward, refusing to look at her fully. He was shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't dare slow down. He couldn't. The woman's figure disappeared into the darkness behind him, swallowed by the night. Tom let out a shaky breath, his mind racing. I did it. I didn't stop. But then, a new dread settled over him. It wasn't over. He knew it wasn't over. Sure enough, just a mile or two down the road, he saw it, the town. It loomed ahead of him like a mirage on the horizon. But it wasn't a mirage. The old crumbling buildings looked exactly as they had the first time he'd seen them. The ghost town stood in the distance, its jagged rooftops outlined by the pale light of the rising moon. Tom's heart sank. There was no escaping this. The town was waiting for him. It always had been. The road ahead seemed to narrow as he approached the town, as if it was funneling him directly toward it. Tom gripped the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. The buildings were closer now, their broken windows reflecting the moonlight in jagged shards. The streets looked deserted, but he knew better. Something was there, lurking, watching. Don't slow down. Don't look. The words echoed in his mind again, but it was becoming harder to follow them. The closer he got to the town, the more a strange pull began to take hold of him. His foot felt heavy on the gas pedal, almost as if something was trying to force him to stop. The truck's engine sputtered, the headlights flickering. Tom gritted his teeth, fighting against the unseen force. "No, not today," he growled under his breath. But the pull grew stronger. His truck started slowing down on its own, the engine whining in protest. He pressed the accelerator harder, but the vehicle continued to decelerate. He could feel it. The town was dragging him in. Panic surged through him. "No, no, no," he shouted, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The truck slowed to a crawl as it crossed the invisible threshold into the town. The air around him grew colder, the silence deafening. Tom's breath came in shallow gasps as he felt the presence of something around him, something unseen but close. His headlights cut through the fog that had appeared out of nowhere, illuminating the desolate streets. And then, standing in the middle of the road, he saw them, the woman in white and the man in the leather jacket. They were waiting for him. Tom's hands shook as he brought the truck to a full stop. The engine died, the lights flickering out. He was trapped. There was no escaping now. The woman took a step forward, her face expressionless. Her dark eyes bore into him, her mouth twisted into a faint smile. "Welcome back," she whispered, her voice carried on the cold wind. Tom's heart raced as the man joined her, his bloodshot eyes filled with sorrow. "You were always coming back," the man said, his voice hollow. "No one leaves the town." Tom tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The truck was dead. He was dead. The figures moved closer, their steps slow and deliberate. Behind them, the ghostly outlines of other figures began to appear, shadows in the fog, all watching him. The town had claimed him, and as the fog thickened around the truck, Tom finally understood the truth. This wasn't just a place haunted by ghosts. This was a place of ghosts, and now he was one of them. Forever.